Since the beginning of time, experts, Christians, and people who are just interested have been wondering, if God made Adam and Eve the first people, how did their son Cain find a wife? Where did that woman come from? In a world where the first people had just moved in, this detail raises a quiet mystery that lies between the lines of Genesis. Other than Adam and Eve's children, were there other people? Or did the Bible leave out important information about the first couple's children and grandchildren? Many people are surprised to find that the answer is hidden between the lines of the Holy Book, ready to be seen by those who are willing to look closely and understand. The first chapters of Genesis tell the story of how the world was made. This story not only tells us where people came from, but it also sets the stage for the connection between God and people. God makes Adam out of dust and gives him life. Then he makes Eve from his rib, joining them in a holy bond that will last forever. The first people to live on earth were born from this union. In Eden, the pair lives in peace and has a direct connection with God. But once the sin was committed, paradise was lost, and people had to start their trip outside the garden walls. Adam and Eve start a new part of their lives when they are kicked out of Eden. Outside the garden, things were not as nice. But life went on, with pain, sweat, and hard work. Still, they had kids. Cain, the oldest child, and Abel, his younger brother, were among them. Cain worked the land, and Abel took care of the sheep. There are two roots, two callings, and two different ways to serve and work. At some point, they both decide to give the Lord gifts. Cain gives the fruits he picked while working in the field. Abel, on the other hand, picks out the best animals from his flock and gives them as an offering. The way the gods responded to these actions shows a huge difference. God takes Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. Even though the Bible doesn't go into great depth, everyone knows that the way each person gave their gift was very important. Abel's behavior showed that he was devoted and committed. On the other hand, Cain's seemed automatic and not really committed. Cain is filled with anger because he feels rejected. He changes how he looks. His anger changes him on the inside. God notices this change and, out of kindness, tells him, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you don't do what is right, sin is right outside your door, and it wants to hurt you. You must control it." Genesis 4:7. We are being warned, and there is still time to do the right thing. Cain gives in to his worst thoughts, even though God told him not to. He tells Abel to go out into the field, where their parents can't see them. In that moment of uncontrolled anger, Cain kills his own brother. The first death of a person marks the earth. The ground is full of Abel's blood, a tragedy that can't be fixed, caused by envy and rejection. God asks Cain right away after the crime, "Where is your brother Abel?" Even now, Cain's answer, "I don't know," rings true. Am I looking out for my brother? Not only with his brother, but also with the Creator, his coldness shows a deep rift. Sin was now living among people. Cain was then given a sentence by God. He would become a runaway and a stranger on the earth. But there are also parts of justice that are kind. God gives Cain a mark that keeps people from killing him if they find him. That mark shows the balance between being harsh and being kind. Cain is sent away to the land of Nod, which is east of Eden. Many people are surprised at this point. When Cain gets to Nod, he gets married and has a son named Enoch. But how could anyone get married if there were only Adam, Eve, and their children up to that point? The key to this answer is in the way the Bible is put together. Genesis 5:4 says that after Seth was born, Adam had sons and daughters. The Bible mostly talks about the main players in the story, but that doesn't mean there aren't other straight descendants of the first couple. So it makes sense, and most experts agree, that Cain married one of his sisters or cousins. In those early times, this wasn't seen as a sin or evil, even though it may seem strange or wrong to us now. Laws against these kinds of marriages didn't start until many hundreds of years later with Moses. By that time, there were many more people on earth, and the genetic risks of breeding with other people were more clear. After that, Cain builds a city to honor his son Enoch. It could be an effort to make things right or to make something that will last. The person who stained the ground with blood is now building things on it. Though it was started by someone who has been through a lot of pain and mistakes, civilization starts to take shape. Cain's bloodline goes on. Jabal is the father of people who live in huts and raise animals. Jubal is the father of people who play the harp and flute. And Tubal-Cain is the father of people who make instruments out of bronze and iron. Culture, art, and science all got their start through them. These things come from a line that has been tainted by sin, but is still a part of God's plan to fill and rule the earth. While this is going on, Adam and Eve are sad. Cain being sent away and the pain of losing Abel are both signs of the fall in Eden. That's not the end of the story, though. They get another boy from God. His name is Seth. Eve says, "God has given me another child in place of Abel because Cain killed him." Genesis 4:25, when he is born. People will once again be able to call on the name of the Lord through a new bloodline that comes from Seth and not Cain. The Bible doesn't give away all the details when it tells these stories. But we know that the divine plan went on because of the signs it leaves behind. God was always there, even when there was sin, bloodshed, and separation. When you ask about Cain's wife, it means you should look deeper. The Bible doesn't avoid riddles. It gives them as gifts to people who pay close attention and look for them. So, what looked like a puzzle with no solution turns out to be another part of a carefully thought-out plan. That's why Cain was able to find a wife. There were other people living like brothers and sisters who were born after Adam and Eve. People have grown in silence since the beginning. Even the first mistakes, like Cain's, didn't stop God from working out his plan for the world. Please subscribe to our channel and leave a like if you like stories that bring new light to lost parts of the Bible and make you wonder about God's plan for people. Every secret detail is brought to light here for your faith. Also, if you want to help this job, please leave a thank you very much. We can keep telling more Bible stories and spreading this message of faith and hope thanks to your gift. Thank you so much for your help. Let's keep going on our trip today. God's question, "Where is your brother Abel?" rang out like thunder. Cain's cold and denial-filled answer, "Am I my brother's keeper?" not only tried to avoid taking responsibility for the crime, but it also showed that his heart was no longer in line with truth or forgiveness. The Creator, who could see everything, didn't need Cain to tell him what had happened. He knew. The ground shook with the sound of Abel's blood. Now, the penalty could not be put off any longer. God then gave the sentence. Cain would get hurt. He would no longer be able to grow fruit on the land that had once given it life. He used to be able to settle down like a farmer, but now his life would be like a nomad's. He would be constantly moving, homeless, restless, and rootless. The person who killed his brother would now have a fate that would go in many different directions. Cain was not only hurt physically, but also in a spiritual way. He would no longer be able to connect with the land. The very ground that had killed Abel would now not give him food. Cain had planned his whole life around farming and planted, gathered crops, but he saw everything fall apart. Neither did he belong anywhere else. He had a broken life because he was cut off from God and no longer had a reason in life. The words had an instant effect. Cain was upset and said, "My punishment is too great for me to bear." He knows that the sentence is harsh, but he doesn't feel bad about what he did in his words. He cried out, not to be excused, but because he was afraid of what would happen. Getting hurt was scary for him. A man who doesn't have any safety and is open to being hurt by people who want to do justice themselves. God doesn't react with more judgment, which is strange. Instead, he protects them. He puts a sign on Cain. The meaning of the sign is not explained in depth, but it is clear that it is meant to keep people from killing him. It would be 7 times worse for anyone who tried to do that. This is where God draws the line. Cain will be punished. but he will not be permanently killed. Once more, the Creator shows that his fairness and kindness go hand in hand. After this help from God, Cain leaves. To the point. Instead of staying with the Lord, he leaves and goes to the land of Nod, which is east of Eden. He tries to start over there. He marries a woman whose background is not explained in the Bible, and the two of them have a son named Enoch. Cain builds a city and names it after his son to honor the birth of his child. He seems to be doing this because he wants to leave a memory, even though he feels guilty about what he did in the past. At this point in the story, a lot of questions come up. Where did Cain's wife come from? Before that, the Bible only talked about Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. How could there be anyone else to marry? Even more, why did he think other people could kill him if there weren't any other people? You can find the answers to these questions in the book of Genesis. Adam had sons and daughters, it says in Genesis 5:4. Even though the story is mostly about certain characters, especially those who are important to the bloodline that would lead to Noah, Abraham, and later Jesus, that doesn't mean there weren't any other children. The Bible only talks about some parts of history. Not all names or events are listed in order or with enough information. Since this is the case, it seems likely that Adam and Eve had many children over time. Cain's wife was most likely a sister or niece of his. During the early days of mankind, before the Mosaic rules were made, these kinds of unions were not against the law. There weren't any risks to inbreeding back then, and the genetic purity of the first people was part of how creation was meant to work. Also, Cain's fear of being killed by other people shows that the number of people was already growing. Genesis 4:14 says, "I will be a runaway and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." If only his parents were living, this wouldn't make sense. There were other people, and they could really be dangerous, as shown by Cain's plea for help and God's answer, which leaves a mark on him. When we think about how long Adam lived, Genesis 5:5, this idea of a rapid population growth is not crazy. With that long of a lifespan and no limits on having children, it is easy to see how the population could have grown quickly in the early generations. Each of Adam and Eve's children could have had many children too, creating different groups of people as early as the first few hundred years of history. Some interpreters take a less standard and more theoretical view and say that God might have made other people who are not related to Adam directly. Most traditional theological groups, on the other hand, don't agree with this theory because it goes against the idea that sin and death came into the world through one man, as Romans 5:12 says. It fits better with the Bible story to think that Adam and Eve were the first people God made, but they had many children and grandchildren over time. The story is mostly about important characters like Cain, Abel, and later Seth. However, there are many other people in the background whose stories have not been written down. So Cain's wife and the possible stalkers he talks about in his lament are part of that generation whose presence is taken for granted, but whose names are not named. The way Cain built the city, which was named for his son Enoch, also shows a lot about how he felt. Even though he was cursed and kicked out, he still wants to make something that will last. He may have gone to the city to get rid of the stain of his past, or to protect his children from the uncertainty of their traveling life. Even if it comes from someone who has lost God's favor, it is an attempt to gather, rule, and control. Cain's family tree goes back many generations. Names like Ired, Mujael, Methushael, and Lamech come from it. Lamech is known for being violent and for bringing marriage. In many ways, Cain's reputation seems to be weighed down by the weight of his first choice. But this family tree is also linked to early cultural advances. Jabal is seen as the father of people who live in huts and take care of flocks. Jubal is linked to singers, and Tubal-Cain is linked to blacksmiths who work with bronze and iron. So growth in the world also comes from the children and grandchildren of someone who fell, showing that God let man keep going on his journey despite the curse. So the story of Cain is linked to the secrets of how people came to be. His story doesn't end when he kills Abel. It goes on with pain, imprisonment, and efforts to put things back together again. By knowing how many people were born at that time and what the mark God put on them meant, we can see that even in the darkest parts of the Bible, there are signs of continuity, growth, and most of all, meaning. Scholars and philosophers have always had an argument about how humanity grew so quickly from Adam and Eve's first children and grandchildren. There is one school of thought that says more than the direct children of the first couple would have been needed for the population to grow so quickly as the first chapters of Genesis imply. This theory tries to figure out how the Bible story fits with archaeological and anthropological evidence that shows organized societies, tools, old villages, and human graves in various parts of the world from very long ago. However, this proof is not related to the Bible, even though it is useful for archaeology. The Bible doesn't say anything directly about how God made people other than Adam and Eve. On the contrary, it is clear that Adam was the first man made from earth's dust, and Eve was the first woman made from his rib. They were the first people in history. Any explanation that supports the idea that other peoples were made at the same time is just trying to fill in the blanks. It is not directly supported by the Bible. Genesis only talks about Adam's family tree. There are more kids than just Cain, Abel, and Seth who were named at first. Genesis 5:4 makes it clear that Adam had sons and daughters. This simple statement is very important because it means that there may be many relatives who have not been written in detail. The sacred book picks and chooses what it says. Instead of trying to tell everything that happened, it focuses on the people who are important to God's plan to save the world. A lot of experts say that Cain built a city and started a family based on this larger group of Adam and Eve's children. He most likely married one of his sisters or a niece who was the daughter of one of his brothers. In the past, especially in the very beginning of human history, it was not only okay, but also important for close cousins to get married. It would be thousands of years before the Mosaic rule came out that would later forbid such unions. Even Cain's birth is talked about in detail. Eve says, "I have gained a man with the help of the Lord," right after giving birth. This supports the idea that back then, every birth was seen as a wonder, a direct interaction between God and people. There is no similar comment for Abel, which could mean that other children were born during this time, but the text only talks about the ones whose stories had bigger effects on the future. It's important to know that families were big in that society, and at that time, couples could have dozens or even hundreds of children over the course of their lives because there were no birth control methods available, and the first generations lived very long. Adam lived for 930 years. That's more than enough time to father many generations of children in the same family. This meant that multiplication was quick and easy. This traditional fact helps us understand why Cain's relationship with a sister or daughter didn't make a fuss or get him in trouble. In fact, it was the only reasonable way for humans to keep going. Back then, there were no written rules or laws about how cousins should treat each other. These rules wouldn't come until after the people of Israel were formed and Moses gave them the law. In addition, the Bible gives other cases of close cousins getting married that support this view. One story that stands out is that of Abraham and Sarah. They are half-siblings because their father was the same, but this marriage is detailed without God saying anything bad about it or saying it was wrong. Abraham, on the other hand, is called a friend of God and the father of faith. His marriage to Sarah was a key part of how the chosen people came to be. The story of Isaac and Rebekah is another important one. Isaac was married to Rebekah, who was the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. Isaac was the son of Abraham and Sarah. This means that Rebekah is Isaac's cousin. Beautiful and careful language is used in the Bible to describe this marriage. It shows that the bloodline God promised will continue. The same thing happened with Isaac's son Jacob, who married Rachel and Leah, who were cousins on both his mom's and dad's sides. To put it another way, the Bible's early parts show a family system that is more like what we would accept today. This idea comes up again with Noah and his kids. Few people lived on earth after the flood. They were Noah, his wife, and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, along with their wives. So the only way for people to start living again was for cousins and other close relatives to get married. The existence of all people relied on these unions. God's original plan and the fact that the first people had pure genes made this kind of union possible and workable. Because of this, the idea that Cain married a sister or niece is not only logical, it fits best with what we know about history and the Bible. It's important to remember that people were made perfect in their first state. The DNA damage we see today is the result of thousands of years of sin, decay, and turning away from God's rules. People in Cain's time were still very close to their roots, which meant that these family ties could work without any harm to the person or the spirit. When we understand these forces, we can look at the story of Genesis in a new way. The story is not just a collection of symbolic figures, it is the real story of the first people who lived on earth. In a few short pages, the Bible tells us about the beginning of humanity, the first wars, the effects of sin, and God's unending kindness. First view, the question of how Cain found a wife seems like an unsolvable puzzle. But when we read the text carefully and understand its cultural background, genealogy, and the natural development of humanity, we can see that it is not. While Cain felt guilty, he was an important part of the growth of the human race. Even though his descendants were not part of God's word, they did help early societies grow in cultural, technical, and social ways. This knowledge also takes the mystery out of the idea that the Bible doesn't follow science or goes against it. The truth is that the Bible shows a clear path of human growth, even though it's not meant to be science. Since Adam and Eve lived a very long time and had many children, it is clear that the earth could quickly become crowded, just as God said in Genesis 1:28, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth." In this way, the question that caused doubt before becomes a chance to think more deeply. When carefully read, the Bible gives answers that, while not exhaustive, are enough to build a sound and logical chain of events about the beginning of human history. Finally, God's faithfulness is at the heart of everything. He moves events, even along roads that are dirty from the fall. Families were very important to the first patriarchs of humanity. For example, Jacob married his cousins Leah and Rachel. This may seem strange to us now, but in their time it was normal and accepted. These marriages weren't because people didn't know any better. They were necessary to keep the human race going in a world that was still very young, where people could only marry people in their own family. The Mosaic law wasn't given out until many centuries later, about 2,500 years after Adam was created. It contained specific rules about how cousins should treat each other, marking a new stage in the growth of society. The rules that God gave Moses helped to keep a big, complicated group of people in order. In that situation, laws that said close cousins couldn't get married made both practical and spiritual sense. They kept genetic problems from happening, set clear moral standards, and kept families holy and pure. But there were no rules like those when Adam, Cain, Seth, or Jacob lived. In the past, people had to get married to each other in order to grow. But if you look at the stories in the Bible, you'll notice a pattern. The stories focus on people who are important to the plan of salvation. This means that a lot of Adam and Eve's original family members stayed unknown. The story starts with Cain and Abel because of the drama of the first murder. It then moves on to Seth because of his connection to Noah's family tree. Finally, it talks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The other sons and daughters are mentioned in Genesis 5:4, but they don't have names or stories. They're like sounds that were lost in the shadows of creation. This lack of information is not something that was left out. It is a choice made by the author. The Bible's purpose is not to record every event that has happened since the beginning of time, but to record what is necessary to share God's message with people. There are only so many stories that can fit in one book. But the fact that there are no names or stories makes people curious about what else might have happened in that faraway time. Because of this, over the course of history, writings from the past called legendary texts have come into being to try to fill in the blanks with additional stories. The Book of Jubilees is one of these books. Some experts think it is a useful source, especially for learning about old Jewish custom, even though it is not part of the official canon of the Hebrew Bible or the Christian New Testament. The name Little Genesis comes from the fact that it goes back to many of the events in the book of Genesis and adds more information about them that isn't in the official versions. The Book of Jubilees tells stories in a very rich way. It suggests a precise order of events by breaking history into 49-year rounds known as Jubilees. This is done to make the order of time easier and also to add things that, while not being confirmed by the Bible, are based on old stories that were told orally among the early Jews. One thing that the Bible doesn't say by name is that this book talks about Adam and Eve's children. This source says that Awan and Asura are two women who stand out. The first one married Cain and the second one married Seth. It makes sense that brothers would marry their sisters in the early days of human growth, but the Book of Jubilees goes even further and gives them names, personalities, and roles in building the first human settlements. There is evidence that these names were not inspired by God, but it is not possible to say for sure that they are not part of secondary traditions. Even religious Jews were interested in learning more about the early days of creation, people who aren't talked about much, and how generations that have been lost grew up. These names are reminders of what could have been, bits and pieces of memories kept alive by cultures that want to know where they came from. It's not a contradiction that Cain found a wife in the land of Nod, as long as you remember that he might have just been leaving his parents and brothers and not definitely going to a place where other people lived. The number of people living there was already growing, and it was possible that some of his brothers and sisters had also left and set up villages. As it says in Genesis 4:16-17, Cain left the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, which is east of Eden. Cain knew his wife, and Enoch was born to her. Cain built a city and named it after his son, Enoch. Building a city soon after Enoch's birth shows that people started organizing themselves into groups. People shouldn't think of this city as a big city hub, but as a planned neighborhood with homes, fields, families, and habits. It was the early stage of life. Cain tried to build something permanent, even though he was marked and sent away. His son was named after him, and his descendants were known for making important cultural and technological improvements in singing, making tools, and taking care of animals. At the same time, Seth, Adam and Eve's other son, was picked to carry on the line that would stay closest to God. Worship of the Lord was brought back through him. The Bible talks about his birth with great respect. When Eve gets him, she says, "God has given me another child to replace Abel because Cain killed him." Enos would come from Seth's family tree. After that, as it says in Genesis 4:26, people began to call on the name of the Lord. It is clear that the lines of descent of Cain and Seth are different. On the one hand, growth for people without any spiritual basis. On the other, the call to worship, obey, and be devoted. God's plan kept going. Even though there is sin in the world, God did not leave his creation. He saw over the generations and made sure that history went forward until the promise of salvation was made, first through Abraham, then through David, and finally through Jesus. Even though these ideas about Adam and Eve's lost children come from stories that aren't in the Bible, they can help us understand how big human history is in the Bible. That's not all the Bible is. It's also a story of a family's journey, with all of its flaws, successes, deaths, and redemptions. As with any family, not all names show up, but everyone left their mark along the way. Cain started a new part of his life after being sent into exile, but he still carried the marks of his mistake. He made a city and named it Enoch after his son. This act wasn't just a tribute, it was also an attempt to rebuild, order, and set things in stone after a guilty past. In Jewish stories that have been passed down through legendary writings, the name Awan, which is also written as Kelima, is used for Cain's wife. Even though her name doesn't show up in the official account of the Bible, she is mentioned a lot in the Book of Jubilees, which adds to the story of the beginning of time for people. Language experts say that the name Aguán comes from Hebrew and Phoenician and can mean anything from power to vice. On the one hand, the strong meaning of her name may come from the role she played with Cain in starting a family and building a city. On the other hand, the bad meaning may come from the problems and moral choices they both had to make after the family tragedy. The two coming together shows an alliance that was made not only because people had to, but also because they wanted to give a life that seemed tainted from the start a new direction. It's amazing that God did not stop Cain from building, enjoying, and passing on his family tree, even though the sentence was harsh. In this case, Awan is very important, not only as a wife, but also as an important part of the new family unit that formed without God's help. Her name and shape become part of the new story of humanity in the making. The Book of Jubilees is not part of the official scriptures, but it contains old stories that tried to fill in the blanks left by the holy texts, mainly about the women of Genesis who were lost. There is a reason why the City of Enoch is mentioned. It was built at a time when people were starting to organize themselves in a more general way. Based on the Bible story, we think that there were already a lot of people living on earth when Cain joined Awan. It had been a long time since they were kicked out of Eden, and since the patriarchs lived so long, it was only normal for the population to grow. Up until that point, only Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, and then Seth are named. There were, however, many more boys and girls among them. Scholars think that the time between Cain's absence and his marriage to Awan may have been around 300 years. During that time, Adam and Eve kept having children, and it's not hard to think that their children also started families. Around that time, Adam had more than 50 children by himself, and Seth had about 20. Because of this steady multiplication, the nearby lands were already inhabited by brothers, cousins, nieces, and other growing families, even though no names were written down. A popular theory is that Awan was Cain's niece because she was Seth's daughter. The amount of time that has passed and the way the story is structured both support this theory. There is no proof that Cain met strange people or people who were not related to Adam. Everything leads back to the same place. Since this was the case, his wife would have been a woman from his own family, which was normal and all right back then. When looking at the first generations of people, the amazing length of life described in the Book of Genesis is another thing that stands out. Patriarchs in prehistoric times lived very long lives, which is very different from how people live today. This long life directly affected population growth and the security of society across generations. Adam lived for 1,030 years. 912 years passed before his son Seth died. Enoch, Adam's grandson, lived for 950 years. Also, Methuselah, Noah's grandfather, lived 969 years, making him the person in the Bible who lived the longest. These numbers are not symbols. They are important points in history that were written down on purpose. They show not only how strong early humans were physically, but also how very different the worlds were before and after the Big Bang. A lot of different ideas have been put forward to try to explain this amazing life. At least one of them says that the Earth was a much better place for life before the flood. The atmosphere would have protected cells from the sun's dangerous rays, which would have sped up cell aging. Early people would have been able to live much longer in this more pure and stable world. Genetics is another theory that many experts agree on. Since God made Adam and Eve, their genes would have been perfect in every way. This original ideal, free of accumulated changes or inherited diseases, would have made sure that the first generations lived a long time and were healthy in both mind and body. As the years went by and people's morals and spirituality got worse, the effects of sin on the body got worse, which slowly lowered life expectancy around the world. No matter what the exact reason is, the fact is that the long lifespans described in the Bible directly caused the population to grow very quickly. Generations lived together for a long time. Parents, children, grandkids, and great-grandchildren lived together for hundreds of years, which made it possible for stories, customs, and wisdom to be passed down orally. In this setting, Cain and Awan made their home, began their family, and created a new place for people to live together. The Bible doesn't name Cain's wife, but other old texts and stories give us hints that help us understand this time in human history better. Awan is more than just an unknown wife. She stands for how life goes on, even when there is pain, being left out, and the weight of bad choices. Even though sin had caused chaos, she helped put things back together. Over the course of the book of Genesis, there is a clear shift in how long people live. In the past, the patriarchs lived for hundreds of years, often longer than 900 years. After the flood, though, this trend starts to change in a big way. God says in Genesis 6:3 that man will only live 120 years, so his spirit will not fight him forever, because he is made of flesh. This sentence sets a limit that was made by God, and it seems to be the start of a new circle for people with different rules. This drop in life didn't happen all at once. It happened over time. Some characters, like Noah, still lived to be over 900 years old, but as time went on, the lifespan of their children went down. As an example, Genesis 25:7 says that Abraham lived to be 175 years old. Moses was one of the most important leaders in Israel's history. He died at the exact age that God had said he would, 120. This change shows more than just a change in biology. It shows a new stage in the link between people and God. There are several reasons for this change. Some talk about how the world changed after the flood. The earth had been protected by certain weather conditions before this world event happened, making it less favorable for living a long time. Climate change, the lack of an effective protective covering, and a lack of resources in some areas may have had a direct effect on people's health and vigor. Some researchers think that the drop was also caused by genetics. The biological makeup of humans naturally broke down over time as generations passed, and cousins continued to get married. The repeated mixing of genetic material that is similar may have led to the development of disease, physical weakness, and less resistance. This DNA breakdown, along with being spiritually cut off from God, made life less robust and more likely to suffer. Another way to look at this change is as something God did on purpose. Over time, having a very long lifespan was no longer needed. In the beginning, it was important for the first humans to live long so that they could spread information, make groups, and have children. But as the number of people and bad things grew, limited life became a way to keep bad things from spreading. A bad person could do more damage the longer they lived, so putting limits on life would be a way to control it. From this, we can see why, when Cain looked for a wife, there were so many close cousins who could help him. After some time, Adam and Eve's children and grandkids had grown, and it was normal, and important for humanity to continue that siblings and cousins married each other. During that time, the Bible doesn't say anything against these kinds of relationships. Before the Mosaic law was made, which was many hundreds of years later, there were no rules against certain things to protect the health and cleanliness of future generations. In Acts 17:26, it is made clear that all peoples come from the same place. From one man he made all the nations of men, that they should live on all the earth, and he set the times for them and the borders of their lands. This sentence supports the idea that all people are related to Adam and Eve. The Bible doesn't back any idea that says there was another origin or that there were multiple human creations. Asura is a character from other stories that go along with the Bible story. In the Book of Jubilees, she is described as the daughter of Adam and Eve and the wife of Seth. Her name, which sounds like the color of the sky or the shine of lapis lazuli, suggests that she is pure and spiritually high, just like Seth's job of carrying on the good family name. The union of the two not only strengthened Adam's offspring, but it also gave people hope again after Abel's death. There are stories that say Asura was first given to Abel. Following his death, she was left without a husband for a while until she married Seth, their son, who was born with a clear purpose, to carry on the faithful lineage. Eve knew what she had to do and told God that he had given her a new child to raise instead of Abel. Asura is not just an inactive character in the family tree. He or she also helps fix what is wrong. Important children were born from this marriage. Someone named Enoch was one of them. His name means fragile man or mortal. He starts a new spiritual era in the history of the world. Then people began to call on the name of the Lord, says Genesis 4:26. This activity marks the start of organized piety among men, prayer, worship, and the desire to link with God. Asura is the first member of Seth's line to have a spirit that is different from Cain's line. While Cain's children were known for making societal and technical progress, Seth's family became the guardians of the faith. Through this line, God would keep his word, which would come full circle hundreds of years later with the birth of Noah, a good man who received favor from the Lord during a time of sin. The stories of these people, even the ones whose names have been lost or left out, are what make people human. Everyone who was born, married, or had a child was part of a bigger plan. And even though the Bible doesn't describe all the details, the bits and pieces that have been passed down through the years show how people have tried to figure out where they came from and what their part is in God's plan. Enoch was not like other people because he was related to Seth. The Bible talks about him as someone who walked with God, which is a short but powerful term that describes a life lived in close contact with God. At a time when evil was on the rise and many people seemed spiritually disconnected, Enoch stood out. He had such a close relationship with God and was so good that he never died. He was taken straight to the side of the Lord instead. Even now, the fact that Enoch's life didn't end on earth and that death was silent is a lesson that living with God is more than just following the rules. It means walking with him. However, Enoch was not the only valuable child of Seth and Asura. Noah, the upright one, was born from the same family tree. God picked Noah, son of Lamech, grandson of Methuselah, and great-grandson of Enoch, to do something that would change the course of history, build an ark to save lives, and most of all, keep hope alive. In the middle of a bad age, Noah found favor with the Lord. This was no small event. It was a turning point in history. Because he obeyed without speaking and had unwavering faith, he was the link between the world that was lost and the new people who would be born after the flood. Each person in Seth's family tree was important in their own way. They are more than just names on family trees. They are important parts of a past that shows decisions, redemption, and vows. The people who came after Cain made cultural and scientific progress by making musical instruments, learning how to work with metal, and organizing cities. The people who came after Seth, on the other hand, kept the flame of worship, morals, and faith alive. Two roots that have existed side by side from the start, showing how complicated life is. The family trees of Cain and Aguán and Seth and Asura give us more than just a list of names. They show two different ways of life, two different kinds of legacies, and two different voices in the past of people. When we read Cain, we see what happens when we make snap choices, the pain of not repenting, and the mark of a heavy past. In Seth, we see rebuilding, a return to the Creator, and the start of a family line that tried to be good, even though they would fail sometimes. In every age, this duality stays the same. We are always being asked to decide whether to go our own way, like Cain, or accept God's leading, like Noah. And even if we fail, we can still come back and fix things. The Bible doesn't try to hide the fact that people make mistakes. Instead, it tells us the truth about them so that we can understand how powerful grace is. Though the Book of Jubilees is an unreliable source, it contains stories about women like Aguán and Asura that are not found in the traditional stories, but help to give a more complete picture of the beginnings of humanity. Along with Cain, Awan is linked to strength and getting through tough times. Along with Seth, Asura is a sign of purity and stability. The stories say that they were both there at the important events that determined the future of all people, working together to make new groups of people. It is important to remember, though, that the Book of Jubilees is not considered to be part of the Bible by most Christians and Jews. Its information is rich and thought-provoking, but it doesn't have any theological authority. But they are historical records that show how people have wanted to fill in the blanks left by the holy text. In the end, the Bible wasn't written to record every little thing that happens in the world. It was written to show what's important: love, justice, and God's plan for saving all people. Isaiah 55:8-9 says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. Just like the sky is higher than the ground, so are my ways and yours." We can learn from this that the Creator has full power over everything, so not everything will be known or understood. The Bible came from God, a guide that doesn't say it knows everything but points you in the right direction for what's important. It doesn't give us all the names, but it does give us the name that is above all names. It doesn't show us every way, but it does show us the important one. This journey started with Adam and Eve and went through Cain, Abel, Seth, Enoch, and Asura. We have seen how choices affect the future, how faith can be kept even when things look hopeless, and how God has been there the whole time, quietly leading everything, generation after generation. Now that I've told you everything, I want to ask you this. Do you believe the story that was written down in old books? The Book of Jubilees is not one of the classic books, but it does give us interesting information. Who do you think Cain's wife was? A sister? A niece? Or, according to some stories, Awan, the woman who is lost in the book of Genesis? No matter what the answer is, one thing is certain: God has a plan. He never stops writing in the book of life, even names that everyone has forgotten. Leave a amen in the comments if this story moved you. Share it with someone who wants to learn more about where we came from and what God wants for each generation. May your faith grow, and may we keep finding out about the secrets in the Bible together. Thank you for following us to the end of this incredible story. See you in the next video. May God be with you always. Amen.